So to add a new client, you just go up to this add button. And the key name things for any client are going to be first name and last name. So for this client, for today's session, let's call him Ben Collins. So first name and last name in order to add them to the system. If you are going to send them the questionnaire, then you'd put in their email and you'd click the use questionnaire box. And then it would send off a questionnaire to them. Basically, as soon as you added them to the system, the client would get an email that would say, welcome to your eState questionnaire, click here to access. And they would click on the link. It would prompt them to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to complete the whole thing in one sitting. They can get back into it to add more information later on. And then they go through it and they add in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they put in that online questionnaire is going to automatically populate back into your system. So if you are using the questionnaire, it can really save a lot of time because you don't have to do all of the manual entry of that stuff. But you don't have to use the questionnaire. Just make sure you don't check the use questionnaire box. You don't need to enter in their email. And then you could use whatever system you have now. So if it's like a PDF or a Word questionnaire that you're sending them, or maybe you like to do it in the meeting with them, you can do that as well. Then we'll go ahead and click Add in the bottom corner. And now today we're going to be doing a spouse client file. And this just means that we're going to be doing wills for both spouses. So anytime you are doing wills for both spouses, you need to add them as separate clients in the system. And then we can link them together using the spouse client function. If you're just doing a will for one spouse and the other spouse is going to be involved in the will, you don't need to add them both as clients. You would just add the spouse to the family tree. But this is if you're doing wills for both of them. So we're going to go up to add. Let's call the spouse Lauren Collins. And then the key thing here is this spouse client function. So you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse to the system. And you click on it, and then you click the first spouse's name from the list, because you need to add the first spouse in order to have them appear on this list so that you can link them together. So this is only when you're adding the second spouse to the system, you do this spouse client function, and now they're going to be linked together. And that just means that any joint assets or shared family tree information will automatically populate in both of their profiles. And then you've also got the option of syncing scenarios and appointments. So if they're going to be doing similar scenarios and the same appointments, you can sync from one to the other so you don't have to do it twice. So this is a key function right here, this spouse client. And we'll go ahead and add. So today it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions throughout the session, just feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in, or you can send it through the Zoom chat if that's easier for you. So that's how you would add the spouse clients to the system, and then you have to pick who you're going to start with. So let's say today I want to start with Ben. So I'm going to click on Ben's name, and it's going to bring me into his profile. So now, because I added Ben and Lauren, those are the only two people on my family tree. I didn't send Ben the questionnaire, so I'm not seeing any additional information. But if you had sent Ben the questionnaire and Ben had filled out his whole family tree, when you clicked on his profile, you would see whatever he put in. But since we didn't send the questionnaire, this is our starting point. So let's say I want to add in some information for Ben. So there's two ways you can do it. You can click edit, and it will edit whoever the blue circle's around. Or you can just double click on the icon that you want to edit. So if I want to edit Ben, I'm just going to double click and it's going to bring up all of Ben's details. So for anyone on the family tree, you're going to want to make sure first name, last name, and gender, all the little star fields, those are filled out. So here we're going to put, another person joining us, but we're going to make Ben male today, let's say. This also known as field, this is important because if Ben is also known as Benny Collins and you want that to appear in the will, we're going to fill out that also known as field. So we're just going to put in Benny Collins, and that way in the will, it's going to say Ben, also known as Benny Collins, and that's going to come out. Date of birth, you can click it from this little calendar, or you can just type it in. So let's say June 6th, 1970, and it will automatically calculate that age for you. The country of birth, you can pick it from the list. Same kind of thing with citizenship. You could do multiple citizenships if they had. And then all of this other information, this is just to have on your file. So the Law Society recommends it, Law Pro recommends it, but it won't actually affect the will. It's just good information to have on your client. Let's scroll down further till you get to residency. So residency is important because it's how the province specifically is how the system knows how to calculate the probate tax throughout. So the default's Ontario, but if you're from another province, you're going to want to change that. But also, we now have Nova Scotia and BC precedents available. So if you're from Nova Scotia or BC, you're going to want to make sure the client's residency is changed to either Nova Scotia or BC in order for those special precedents to generate. So you're not using Ontario precedents. Then the city, let's say Ben Collins is from the city of Toronto. This is important because this city field will populate in the will. So it'll say Ben Collins of the city of Toronto, kind of thing. Then for special circumstances, this is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues that the client might have. So you'd click it off and you could write a description below. So this is really useful because you're going to want to have this data on file, especially if you think that there might be a will challenge down the line. So you would just click it off, you'd write in a deeper description, and then you'd have this information on hand. Then the last one is just direct relationship. So it's just going to list who you're tied to on the family tree. And right now, Ben is tied to Lauren. Ben's married to Lauren, and that's what it tells us. Then we'll go ahead and save. So the client's icon is always going to be in black. It'll be gray if you haven't specified their gender, and then it'll be pink if you put them as female or blue as male. So let's say next we wanted to add a child to the family tree. Whoever this blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So if it's Lauren, we're going to click once and it's going to get the blue circle around her. If we wanted to add to Ben, you just click once and get the blue circle around him. So let's say we want to add Ben's kid. So we go add child. And then we get this prompt and it's going to ask us who the other parent is. Is it Lauren Collins, who's the current spouse? Is it a new parent, so an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will? Or are they a single parent? So either they're genuinely a single parent or they have an ex-spouse, but they're not going to be involved in the will. You could just put them as a single parent. But let's say today it's Lauren. So we're going to say select. And now we have to enter the child's information in. So we're going to put, this child's going to be John Collins, male, date of birth, June 8th, 2000. Now the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client is a place where you can note relationship difficulties, but most importantly is this disability function. So if you click this off, then this is going to tell the system that this individual is disabled. So it'll prompt you for certain planning information in advisor alerts, certain planning considerations, but also if you're setting up a Henson Trust, it's going to recognize that you're gifting it to this disabled individual, and then it's going to draft that special Henson Trust wording. So this is the key trigger right here, this little button. And then we'll go ahead and add John. Now, if you look at your list, you might notice that you don't have an option to add a grandchild or a niece and nephew, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it through direct relationships. So instead of just adding a grandchild directly to Ben, you have to add a child to Ben, and then click on the child's icon and add a child to that child. So I clicked on John to get the blue circle around him. Then I'm going to add a child. Let's say he's a single parent. And now I can enter John's child, aka Ben's grandchild, into the system. So let's call her Lily Collins. We'll say she's female, We'll add her in. Same kind of thing goes for nieces or nephews. You would just click on the client, add a sibling to the client, and then click on the sibling and add a child to the sibling. So that's how you do the family tree. It's through direct relationships. But if it's a family member like a third cousin, or they're not family at all, maybe they're just a friend, an acquaintance, a colleague that's going to be involved in the will in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity, you're going to want to add them in over on the other section. So that way they're going to be in the system, their information is going to be in there, and then later on you're going to have the option to choose them. So you just go other and then you'd add person. Let's say Jordy's going to be a beneficiary later on. So we'll add in Jordy. You could even put the relationship to the client if you want. Let's say he's a friend, male, and then we'll add him in. So that's sort of how the people and the family tree section works. But does anyone have any questions so far? Nope. If you do, feel free to send it through the chat or just unmute yourself and jump in. So next, we'll go over to the asset section. So for the assets, you're always going to start with the general personal effects. And this is just to remind you to gift it to someone in the will. You don't have to value it. You don't have to really enter in any information. It's more just as a placeholder to make sure you're gifting it. So you trigger that special general personal effects clause. For all other assets, it's sort of up to you what you're using the system for. So if you're using it for a planning purpose, maybe it's a really complicated estate, you really want to lay out all the assets, see what they have so that you can advise them accordingly on certain planning things, then you can add them all into the system. If you're just dealing with a really simple will, it's going to be residue to spouse, residue to children, that kind of thing. You don't need to add in every single asset they have. For the will, you really just need to add in the specific asset bequests because you need to first add them in as an asset here so that later on, once we get to the scenarios, you're able to gift them. The same kind of thing goes for registered assets. So if you're either going to confirm or do a new designation in the will, you need to add them here as assets and mark them as joint or designated in the scenario section in order for them to come up in the will. So let's go ahead and add a few assets just to see how it goes. So you go add, then you pick your type of asset and then your specific, your category and then your specific type. So let's start with a bank account. The key thing for adding any assets to the system is you're going to want to call the asset name, however you want it referred to throughout the system and in the will itself. So if we just leave it as bank account and we add in 5 bank accounts, it's going to get kind of confusing as to which is which. So usually I put all the identifying information in the asset name. So maybe it's called the RBC bank account, the account number is 1, 2, 3, 4. That way, if I add an RBC bank account and then a savings account and then a CIBC account, I'm going to be able to differentiate the accounts from each other and then I can gift them accordingly. And I'm not going to get confused because they're not all called bank account. So this asset name field is the one that really counts. The rest is more for information purposes. You can put the balance in and you're going to notice that the probate tax is automatically calculated for you based on Ontario law because that's what we set their client's residency as. But if we set it to something else, it would follow that province's jurisdiction. And then let's just add this bank account in, that looks good. So next, let's go and add a house. So again, however you refer to the asset, maybe we want it called the family home if we gift it in the will. You're going to want that asset name to be changed. If you fill out the address field, it will populate in the will if you're gifting it specifically in the will. So let's put 123 Anywhere Street. If we put in the current value, again, it's going to automatically calculate that probate tax for us. This mortgage/encumbrances field. So if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of that mortgage in this field right here. because for two reasons. First of all, it has an effect on the probate tax that's calculated. And second of all, it's good to know what debt the asset is associated with. So there is an option later on. The next section is called debts, and there is an option to add a mortgage in there. But if it's associated with the specific asset that you're adding into the system, like the home, I would just put it in this field and not add it as a separate debt, because you just want it to be associated with the specific asset and it has an effect on the probate tax. The one thing is just make sure you're not putting it in both sections, because then it will double count it. So best practice is just put it in here and don't add it as a separate debt. Then we're going to change the type to joint. Let's say it's joint, and we're going to click add owner. So we're going to pick the other owner. It's going to list everyone we've added to the system in either the people or the other tab. So we're going to pick Lauren's joint with the spouse. And then we'll go ahead and add in the bottom corner. And because we linked them together, this family home asset is automatically going to appear in her profile as well. So if we just switch over to hers quickly, we're going to see that that family home asset is over in hers too. So we don't need to add it again once we're going through her will, because they're already linked together. Let's do one more. Let's say we're going to do an RRSP. We'll click on that. Again, we can change that to identify it. Let's say it's this RRSP. The beneficiary field, this is just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy, and it's just for information purposes. So later on, you're going to be able to decide whether you want to confirm or designate a new beneficiary. The current value, let's say it's 100,000. So the probate tax, you're going to notice it always calculates, but the income tax doesn't. And that's just because of the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So if you want the income tax to appear, you'll have to do a manual calculation. And we like to just estimate things at a high end. We're not tax experts or anything like that. It's just sort of showing a client an estimate of the highest possible tax that they could incur with this asset. So here, for income tax, if it was a capital gain, if it was something with a capital gain, I would do 25% of that as the value of the gain. But if it's something like an RRSP, I'd put in like 50% of that as the income tax value. And Jordy actually just did a session last week talking about income tax and planning for state lawyers. So it's on our YouTube channel if you want to check that out. And we'll go ahead and add this into the system. So these are all of our assets today. So does anyone have any questions about the assets section? Nope. Okay. Don't be shy if you do. Feel free to jump in. Then we'll go to debts. So again, this is more just for planning. It doesn't really have an effect on the will. You just go to add debt. I would add anything, but not the mortgage, since we already did that. We don't want to double count it. But let's say we have a credit card debt of $5,000. We'll just add that in. So the next section is scenarios. And this is like the most important section because it's where all of the planning takes place. And at most, you're going to plan for 3 scenarios. And then that way, by planning for each of these, your bases are going to be covered no matter what ultimately ends up happening. So the first one is surviving spouse. And this is what happens if the spouse is alive when the client passes. Then you go to descendants only. And this is what happens if the spouse is gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around. And then lastly, you've got no descendants. So this is what happens when everyone's gone. It's like your ultimate disaster, what's happening to the estate. So by planning for each of these, you're covering your bases and you have a plan. So a new thing that we just added in is this little E-plan thing up in the top corner, this lightning bolt. So if we look at this right now, there's nothing in here. No planning's been done, everything's empty because we haven't started yet. But if we go to this little lightning bolt and click on it, it right now has these 3 E-plans that you can choose from. And E-plans are just basically like almost like a really big macro that goes through the scenarios and the appointment section and does the planning for you based on what you put in. So right now it only does it for these 3 scenarios. And these are the sort of most typical situations that we incur. But the great thing about it is, even if your client's sort of plan doesn't meet one of these specifically, you can still run it and then you can go in and change any of the details later. So let's say that for this file, we have a spouse with younger children, and I want to do a trust for the children. I want to run this e-plan because in the surviving spouse scenario, everything's going to the spouse. In the descendants only, everything's going to the children in a trust to the age 25. I like the idea of the age to 25 trust, but maybe I want to put in a distribution at age 21. I can still run this, and then it's going to do a lot of the planning for me, and then I can just go in and change the detail. So it's a great starting point, even if your plan doesn't exactly match any of these. So I'm going to click this one, and then I'm going to click execute. And now it's going to go through and behind the scenes fill out the scenarios and the appointments. So now when I click on surviving spouse, I can see that there's already been planning done for me because of the e-plan. So we'll start with the joint designated assets section. So it's going to pull any assets that we've marked as joint on the assets tab, or any registered assets. It's going to designate them right to the spouse. And it's showing us that these assets are falling outside of the estate. So that's done for us. Then we can go to initial gifts. So right now it has the general personal effects as going to Lauren. We can see the details, Lauren, absolutely. And that'll generate that special general personal effects clause because we gifted it specifically in the initial gift section. Then the balance of the estate, it's going to have everything absolutely going to Lauren 100%. We don't need to put a gift over in here because the second scenario, the descendants only, is the gift over essentially. So this scenario looks good. I don't need to make any changes here. I like this. Then we'll go to descendants only. So probably not going to be any joint or designated assets. Initial gifts, the general personal effects have been gifted to the children. If I wanted to change that, I could just exit it and specifically choose the child, but I could also choose the class. And to choose the class, you just click on the beneficiaries line and you scroll down. Then I can pick the class of children. And later on, I can decide whether I want to keep this class open to future children. Then lastly is the balance of the estate. So right now, let's see what it has. You just click on the gray bars at the bottom to bring up the details. So it's got a trust to the class of children for 100%. The duration is when the beneficiary reaches age 25. That's okay. Mandatory payments. Right now there are none. But let's say I want to do stage lump sums at certain ages. I'll add a stage. At age 21, I'm going to do a percentage of 25%. So at age 21, they'll get 25%, and then at age 25, they get the rest. I like that. So this looks good. And then the gift over is to beneficiaries issue, and then if not, if they don't have issue, then to the other class members, so the other children. So this looks good. This is what I wanted to do, so I'll save it, and it's going to save those changes for me. And since I made a change to this, maybe Lauren's also going to want the change in her will as well. So to copy everything I've done in this scenario over to Lauren's scenario, I just click on her name up in the top corner. And this is the sync button. So it basically copies everything you've done here and puts it into her profile as well. And it just does it per scenario. So if I also wanted to make changes to the last scenario, I'd have to sync that one over if I wanted those changes copied over to her. So now the descendants only scenario looks good, and we'll go to the no descendants scenario. So here I've got probably just dealing with the balance of the estate. And in that e-plan, it automatically puts half to siblings and then half to spouses' siblings. But let's say this is not what I wanted to do in this scenario at all. I don't have any siblings. I wanted to give it half to Jordy, and half to a charity. So let's just clear this. I'm going to get rid of this breakup, and we're going to start from scratch. So if you were doing things manually, you just start by adding a segment. So we're going to call this segment 1 for 50% since we're making 2 segments. And now you have to basically specify what's happening with this 50%. And you do that by adding a gift. So we're going to pick absolute to Jordy. It says percentage 100 because it means 100% of the 50%. So we're not dividing it up further. And then let's say we'll put a gift over into his issue, and then we'll add. So this looks good. Now we have to deal with the other 50%. So you're not going to add a gift because we've already dealt with 100% of this 50%, but we need to get back to the main segments page and add another segment. So you click on this little grayed out segments button. This is key, and that's going to get you back to that main page. And then you go and add segment. We'll call this one segment 2 for the other 50%. And then we're going to click add gift. And we'll click on beneficiaries. And oh, I want to add a charity. Let's say the charity's not in the system. If they are in the system, you just scroll down this list and you can pick the charity that you want, that you've already added. But if it's your first time adding this charity, you just go to the 3 dots and you go to the new charity button. And then you type it in. So I'm going to give it to Epilepsy Toronto. And if they had a CRA number that I knew, I'll just put it on that line. So just ignore that ID field. It won't populate, so just leave that be. But if you want it to come out in the will, just put it on the name line with the charity name. And then we'll add and add. And now we've dealt with 100% of this 50% and therefore 100% of everything. And we'll sync this scenario over to Lauren. So we'll click on Lauren and sync this specific scenario over to her profile as well. So that can be a lot to digest, the scenario section, but are there any questions here? No questions. Okay, we'll keep going then. We can go to appointments next. So because we ran that E-plan, it's going to give the primary estate trustee, it's going to make it Lauren, the spouse. But let's say we wanted to add an alternate. You just go to add, you pick your appointee. Let's say Jordy's going to be an alternate. And to make them an alternate, you play with the condition. So if you're going to be primary, if you wanted him to be a joint primary with Lauren, you would select none and he'd be a primary. If you wanted him to be an alternate, you'd say if all specified cannot act. And that way it's going to say Lauren. If Lauren cannot act, then Jordy. And depending on what you want to do, if you want joint primaries, joint alternates, you just play around with the condition to make it either the same or different as the other people that you've appointed. And for the appointment section, the sync button's actually in the bottom left corner over here. So if we want to copy the appointments over to Lauren, we're going to click her name and we're going to sync it over. And it will interchange, it'll change Ben and Lauren's name, so Lauren's not her own estate trustee. Then we'll go to provision.
Michaela, could you show us how you do like a further alternate? So like if Jordy wasn't going to be the alternate, then like
yes,
what you would do?
So if Jordy wasn't going to be an alternate and you wanted to add a further alternate if Lauren or Jordy couldn't act, you just go add, you'd pick your further alternate. And then I would say if all specified cannot act, then I would take out Lauren and I'd pick Jordy as the specified instead. Okay. So that way it would be Lauren. If Lauren can't, then Jordy. If Jordy can't, then John.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. So for provisions, the first thing up here is funeral arrangements. So if you want these funeral arrangements to come up in the will, you just type them right on the line. So if you say be cremated, there we go. If not, you just delete the text and then there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. The include future members thing is if you're doing class skips like we did in the will, you can include future members of that class in the definition. So say, for example, we wanted to include future children in the will. When it defines children, it'll say John Collins and any other child born to me and Lauren kind of thing. Class restrictions, you can include or exclude certain members being a part of the class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is a general trust clause, and it's going to guide underage beneficiaries that haven't had specific trust set up for them. So if it ends up going to like a grandchild through a gift over and they haven't had a specific trust set up, it'll be governed by this general clause. But it won't affect anything that you've actually set up in the will. And then the secondary will assets, this is if you're doing primary and secondary, so corporate wills, then you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. But if you're just doing a single will, you don't have to check or uncheck any of the boxes. It won't have any effect. The last two things I'm not going to get into today, but it's just powers of attorney, financial and personal care. And they work the same way as the appointment section, where you just pick your primary and then you pick your alternate. Up here, this little exclamation point in a circle, this is what we call advisor insights. So it's almost like a checklist based on what you're putting in the system that's helping to advise you of certain planning considerations. So if you've missed putting things in, like we didn't put in Lauren's gender, if we went back to the people tab, put in her gender, then this advisor insight would go away. But not all of them go away. Like this request prior wills, it will never go away. And it doesn't actually affect the generation of the will. It's just sort of to advise you, so you're more confident that you're not forgetting any important planning considerations. Beside this is just the notes function. You can make any notes on your client that you want. So maybe you wanted to note that you had to ask about the spelling of someone's name, or that you'd done a title search on a property, those kind of things. You can put in the notes, and then it will populate at the end of the text summary. And the last button is the download button. So this is where you're going to generate your summaries and your documents. So there's 3 summaries. The first one is the profile summary. And it's going to give you a PDF of all the information that you've put in the system. So either that they put in their questionnaire or that you've filled out for them like we did today. So profile information, family tree information, and assets as well as debts. So this is great for your file. It's just all of the client's information. Then the next one is the graphic scenario summary. It's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will for each of the scenarios. And if you're putting in values, it's going to be great as well, because it sort of shows you what's happening and what's going where and what the net value of their estate is looking like. Then the last one is the text scenario summary. So this is going to give you all the details on all the gifts that you've created. So it's got who your trustees are, what's joint designated, what its initial gifts, how is the balance of the estate getting divided up. It's just got all the information without the legalese. It's like the will without the legalese, essentially. So it can be really useful in breaking things down for the client. Then we're going to go to documents. So right now, these are all the documents you can generate. Today, we're going to do a single will. You can always change the signing date or take it out and manually put it in the will later. The registered asset designation, this is if you want those assets, the registered assets confirmed or new designation in the will, you check this box for that clause. The joint designated asset confirmation, this is if you've got a client with a lot of assets that are jointly owned with adult children and you want to confirm that they're truly joint, not held on a resulting trust, then you can include this clause. Counterpart is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. It's just got some wording on that. Simplified provisions, it's a simpler will. So if you're not dealing with trusts, if it's just really simple, then it's just going to be a shorter will with less definitions and less powers. Then the will guide's a nice little chart at the end of the will that will guide the client to the clauses in their will, so it helps with their understanding. And then the cover page is just a cover page to the will. For witnesses, you can pick anyone else that's a user on your account, or you can just click this blank box and you can manually put it in the will. And then you just click generate, and it's going to give you a Word document that's fully editable, so you can do any changes that you want to change, any edits, all of that kind of stuff. It's fully editable. It's a Word document. You can make any changes. So let's just briefly go through it. So the first, this funds and plans, this is because we check that registered asset box. The assets passing outside of the will, this is because we check the joint asset box. Then you've got definitions. Because we opted to include future children in the provision section, so it defines my children as John Collins and any other child born to me and Lauren. Here's our appointments. We picked Lauren. If not Lauren, then Jordy. Disposition of personal effects. You're going to get this little red highlight just because for the general personal effects, it's going to ask you to decide whether or not you want the division of those personal effects to be left up to the trustee's discretion, or if you want to implement some sort of lottery system or something like that. So you either just take out A, B, and C, or you leave it in, depending on whether or not it's just going to be up to the trustee's discretion. Then you've got the residue. So it's going to the children. You've got that trust to 25 years with 25% at 21. And then ultimate distribution, 50% to Jordy, 50% to Epilepsy Toronto. And then I'm just going to scroll to the bottom. Oop. Here's your will guide for the clients to the clauses in the will. And that's how you go about it. So that's how you'd go through that file. Then you would go back over to Lauren's profile. You'd go through it to make sure you didn't have to make any big changes, and you would make any changes you had to make. And then you would go and generate her documents in her profile as well. And one thing, if you do ever get stuck on anything, you can of course email me directly, or you can email support. But you can also click this little question mark up in the top corner, and it's going to bring you over to our help desk. And it's got lots of articles on how to do certain things in the system. It's usually a step-by-step. It's got some pictures, so it can be a really good resource if you get stuck on anything. But of course, you can always email me as well. So that is sort of it for today. But before we wrap up, does anyone have any specific questions about anything?
Michaela, I was just wondering, when you're dealing with spouses, does it send them each a separate questionnaire to fill out, or can one spouse fill out the questionnaire for both of them?
So you have the option. You can either send it to both of them, but usually what I do is I add the first spouse in normally, and then when I'm adding the second spouse and I click the joint spouse, the spouse client function, then I just send the questionnaire to the second spouse, because as long as you've connected them, that spouse can do all of the questionnaire for the both of them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Okay, well, I would just like to thank everybody so much for joining me today, and don't ever hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to jump on a Zoom and walk you through it, or just email you back if I've got an answer to your question. Can I repeat the last answer? So you don't have to send the questionnaire to both clients. You have that option. Here, maybe I'll just show everybody. So when you're adding a client, you could do it normally, and you could send the questionnaire to Joe Black, and then you could click use questionnaire. You'd put in Joe's Black email, and then you'd add him to the system. And then when you clicked add to add his spouse, you could do the same thing and click let's say then the spouse would be Jane Black, enter her email, and click use questionnaire. But this is how I would do it. I would go add Joe Black, and I would just add him in normally. And then when I'm adding Jane Black, I would go Jane Black, Jane at Rogers.com, spouse client, Joe Black, use questionnaire. And then when I clicked add, it would send off that use questionnaire to Jane's email, but she would be able to enter in the information for the both of them just because she's connected to Joe Black here. So this spouse client feature is the one that's really important, because if you don't link them, then Jane can't enter in Joe's information. But if you do, then she can enter in her information and Joe's information. No problem. Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap things up because we're almost at 1:15, but yeah, thanks again for joining me, and feel free to reach out directly if you have any other questions.